Number 100. We're going to number 100. Chorus, Thou Art Worthy. Number 100. Thou art worthy, thou art worthy, words are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory, glory and honor, glory and honor and power. For thou hast created, has all things created, thou hast created all things, and for the pleasure thou art created, for thou art worthy, O Lord. One more time. Thou art worthy, thou art worthy, thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory, glory and honor, glory and honor and power. For thou hast created as all things created, thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are created, for thou art worthy, O Lord. And number 310. The first line says, lead me to Calvary, says, King of my life, I crown thee now. We need to remember who is King of our lives. We put a lot where we watch the elections and things and all the rigmarole with that, but we got to know where our allegiance lies and who's the real master and Lord of our lives. So, things happen on earth, the Lord's in heaven, and he takes count of all that stuff. So we got to trust him. Lead me to Calvary. King of my life, I crown thee now. Thou shalt the glory be. Lest I forget thy thorn crown brow, lead me to Calvary. Lest I forget Gethsemane, lest I forget thine agony, lest I forget thy love for me, lead me to Calvary. Third, let me like Mary through the gloom come with a gift to thee. Show to me now the empty tomb, lead me to Calvary. Lest I forget justice, lest I forget thine agony, lest I forget thy love for me, lead me to Calvary. And at last, may I be willing, Lord, to bear daily my cross for thee, even thy cup of grief to share, thou hast borne all for me. Lest I forget Gethsemane, lest I forget thine agony, lest I forget thy love for me, lead me to Calvary.
All right, with Tim's getting things rolling here. So is anybody surprised by the election? No? I'm not. I think it's exactly how we all thought it was going to play out. We're just hoping it wasn't.
Open it.
So. Yeah, I think that's what we're looking at. So, and well, that's exactly. I was thinking about that tonight. Like Yogi Berra said, it's not over till it's over. So we'll just play it out, see where it goes. But so far, I mean, I don't know who you voted for. I kind of suspect I know, but President Trump has already been able to win all the other things, so I guess he'll win this one too, right? So we'll see. But so we got a lot of exciting things going on all over the place, and I knew I should have set my clock back. That's one extra hour in 2020. I don't. I'm just like no more. So. But hey, we'll take some prayer requests, continue praying for our country and all that goes on. But we have other good news going on. But here's the good news. Tim's got the good word. So here we go.
Thank you.
We still trust in the Lord.
So I've got the man behind the curtain there doing the scrolling on the screen for me because my computer would not cast, but that's fine. We're good to go. We're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 13. Maybe I'll try to give a quick backstory. I don't want to take too much time because most of us were here. What's it been, a month now? At least a couple of weeks. Yep, 1 Samuel chapter 13. Up to this point in 1 Samuel, we've came obviously in the beginning of the chapter we're introduced to Samuel, who the book is named after, as a young man, and then kind of the next story it shifted into was talking about how Israel wanted a king. They up to this time they were kind of ruled by like a theocracy. Samuel being God's man, he was the last judge in Israel, but he also acted as a prophet and kind of a leader of the country there, but not as a king, but as God's man. It being a theocracy. But Israel started to look around and look at the other nations around them and seeing how that they were run by kings. And they started to want the same thing. They kind of had the grass is greener on the other side kind of thing going on there. And they basically God told them that they were rejecting him and wanting something different than what God had for them. He spoke some things through Samuel and basically said, I'm going to give God's people, I'm going to give them what they want. So it's kind of interesting how we're seeing, and I was sitting and talking to somebody the other day. It was either today or yesterday. I'm talking to Chris, I think, and how the whole Bible literally is kind of geared towards or talking about in some way Jesus Christ. And we can see even in the book of 1 Samuel, we can see God starting to implement this kingly line. And we're going to find out in chapter 13, God's going to reject Saul's line, and he's going to put in a different line. But in this kingly line that God's setting up here right now as we're watching and as we're reading is going to be the line which Jesus Christ is going to be born into. So it's kind of neat as you kind of see the story coming to fruition. And we spoke it several times through these stories, how God does have dominion over what goes on in the world. He literally has a plan that he's working, and what God's plan says and what he says will happen. He's never lied before, never made a mistake before, never been out of power. The Bible literally says the heart of kings is turned this way and that by God's will and God's power. So we can see God kind of implementing his plan, even his plan of salvation, back here starting in 1 Samuel. All right. In this chapter, we're kind of moving on to, we went through this whole ordination process where God placed Saul as the king in Israel. Almost kind of, and we'll kind of start to see it starting in this chapter, almost kind of as a condemnation over what they were looking for in a king. And we're going to kind of see some of these things come through Saul, where things weren't quite exactly what they were hoping it would be when they wanted a king. But let's start with a word of prayer, and we'll break into it tonight. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for whatever it is that you have for us tonight. As we continue the story about Saul and about Samuel and about what's going on in this book, press on our hearts what you'd want us to learn and what you want us to take away. No matter where we read in the Bible, you can work on our hearts, and you can have power and dominion in our lives if we allow you to. Help us to learn something new, or somehow be changed because of our study tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so let's do a reading through. Like I said, I'm going to have David scroll past on the screen for me. And we put it on the live stream as well tonight, so we're going to see how that works. I lost my mouse. Where's my mouse? There it is. Technology is good, but until it's not. All right. Starting verse 1. Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel, whereof 2,000 men were with Saul in Michmash and in Mount Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. You guys know who Jonathan is, right? Son of Saul, thank you. Yep, and it'll mention it later on in the chapter. I just want to make sure we're on the same page here. All right, so he kind of has his son under him as a leader going on here too, all right? And 1,000 men were Jonathan and Gibeah of Benjamin, and the rest of the people he sent every man to his tent. And Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was at Gibeah, and the Philistines heard of it, and Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." Okay, so we see Jonathan had some victories here over the Philistines, and the word starts getting out to the Philistines that there's some conquering going on here, and we're going to find out they're not very happy, and they start to make battle against Israel, and it becomes a little bit scary when we start reading what's going on here. Verse 4, it says, "All Israel heard say that Saul had smitten a garrison of the Philistines, and that Israel also had an abomination with the Philistines. And the people were called together after Saul to Gilgal. And the Philistines gathered themselves together to fight with Israel." And kind of look at these numbers right here and get a grasp on it as we look at the numbers Israel has. They gathered themselves together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. And they came up and pitched in Michmash, eastward from Bethaven. Okay, is it pretty simple to say that they got the Philistines' attention here? All right, and compare that to how many people did Saul have kind of lined up? Like 3,000 altogether, right? If I did the math right. They had more than that in chariots alone. All right, and they're all lined up ready to do this thing. All right, and I'm kind of busting through this here because there's a point I want to get to near the end of the chapter here. When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, or the people were distressed. You guys know what that means by they were in a strait? It's an old English way to say things. All right, they're in a bind here. All right, they were stuck. They did, obviously, you see the battle lines drawn, and you can kind of see things lining up. And you're like, this isn't really balanced, right? This isn't fair. All right, so they're in a strait, and it says for the people were distressed. All right, and I think that's kind of a nice way to say it, right? They're scared. And they've been there before, but they're scared. And the people did hide themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks and in high places and in pits. All right, and I'm kind of envisioning this. They're kind of, I don't know if you've ever been in a part of the country where there's a lot of cockroaches. But you turn on a light and you can see the cockroaches scatter, and then you don't see them anymore. All right, this is what the nation of Israel is doing right here. They're running for the hills, right? Which makes sense that they would. And some of the Hebrews went over Jordan in the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. All right, and I don't mean to laugh here, but I'm just picturing these people being scared here. His armies are scared. And he tarried 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had appointed, but Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. Okay, and this is kind of where the story starts with Saul's reaction to this battle being drawn here. Okay, Samuel was supposed to be somewhere at a certain time, and he was going to do the prayers and have the sacrifices and stuff like that. And Saul's got to where he's supposed to be, and it says, as for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal. Okay, I'm sorry. Before that, he literally says he was there at the time appointed by Samuel. All right, and let's see here. I kind of went back too far here. Yeah, verse 8 says he tarried 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. All right, but Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. Okay, so they had a meeting time, and they had a plan, and Samuel said, I'm going to be at this place at a certain time, and then we're going to kick this thing off, and obviously him as the judge or the prophet in Israel, he's going to be the one that's supposed to be doing the sacrifices and the prayer, praying for God's power and God's guidance in this situation here. And Saul gets there, and Samuel's not there yet, right? It doesn't necessarily say why Samuel tarried, but he wasn't there. And the timing was off, at least according to Saul in his mind. The timing was off. He was ready to go. Samuel wasn't where he's supposed to be. And all of a sudden, Saul starts taking things into his own hands. Am I right? There's something that's supposed to happen before the battle. Samuel's not there, and Saul's taking the bull by the horns, and he's going to do it himself. All right? And we look at verse 9, and it starts. And Saul said, "Bring hither a burnt offering to me and peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offering. All right, so who's offering the burnt offering here? Right, who's doing it here? Saul's doing it. Who's supposed to be doing it? Samuel. All right, Saul's doing something that makes sense in his own mind, I'm convinced of that, but is outside of God's plan and God's will. Right, he's disobeying here. God had a plan and God had a purpose, and Saul, because he didn't want to wait on God's plan, is doing this on his own. All right? Verse 10, "And it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of the offering, the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him that he might salute him." All right? So it seems like Saul still feels like that he did what was right, and he's going out to meet Samuel, and he's going to greet him properly, right? It says he's going to salute him. All right? That means that, according to this verse, he feels he's still doing what he's supposed to be doing, and he's excited to see God's man coming. All right? Verse 11, "And Samuel said, What hast thou done?" All right? Can you imagine Saul going out to greet the man of God, and he's excited about it, and he's going out there to salute him, and he's, I don't want to say he's happy because this isn't a good situation, but he's glad to see him. All right? And the first thing that Samuel says, "What hast thou done?" Imagine the way his heart, while it's up here and excited, it sinks. Because all of a sudden he realized, what did I do wrong? I did something wrong here. All right? And Saul said, "Because I saw the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash." It says, "Therefore said I, the Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering." Okay, so putting it into context a little bit, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe you can correct me, or maybe you disagree with me, but it seems like Saul was doing this out of what he felt like was a need. He was doing this thinking he was doing what was right. I don't necessarily think that his intentions were bad necessarily. All right? But the weird thing is, or the interesting thing is that he was still stepping outside of God's plan. Does that make sense? He might have, out of good intentions, stepped out of his lane, stepped out of what he was supposed to be doing here, and he's going to have consequences because of it. All right, verse 13. This is where maybe his heart might drop here. All right, and Samuel said to Saul, "Thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee." Okay, so this ends up being a big thing here. All right, he was getting ready to make battle with the Philistines, right? The plan was to meet God's man, and they're gonna have basically a prayer service, right? He's gonna do the burnt offerings and all that kind of stuff in it. The way that said it was make supplications to the Lord, and they were to do that before battle. Reasoning being, it doesn't really matter which army is bigger than which, because when God's on your side, God's got it, right? That seems to kind of be our theme this year. God's got it, right? If God has a plan, and we know what he's doing, and we get on board with it, we can know and we can have faith that God's got it. God's got it tenfold. God's got control, all right? God has dominion over what he's doing. God has a plan, and he's working it. we can have faith and confidence that what God has is the best, right? And he knows what he's doing. We kind of step out of the way and then step in line to what God's doing, and God will take care of it. It doesn't matter what comes before us. And that's kind of what's supposed to be going on here. God's got it. God's got a plan. You know, Saul might be looking at these armies, and he's looking at all these thousands and thousands of the Philistines getting ready to make battle with them, and they have, 3,000 people, and most of them are running away. Right? Literally, they're scattered because they're scared. And Saul, all right, he kind of starts stepping out, not in faith, he's stepping out in doubt. Am I right? He's saying, well, this is what God's plan was, but I don't see God doing what he promised to do here. So I need to do something, or else this is going to fail. He starts stepping out, like I said, not in faith, but in doubt. He starts stepping outside of God's plan, thinking that either God's plan wasn't the best, or thinking that God had promised something that he's not fulfilling here, or something. And he starts getting nervous, and he's seeing these battle lines draw, and he's thinking, I have to do something. All right? If Samuel's not going to come and do this, I need to make supplication from God. If you go back a couple of verses here, he says, in verse 12, he uses the word forced, all right? It says, therefore said I, the Philistines will come down upon me to Gilgal, all right? He's got in his mind what's going to happen, right? If I don't do this, this is what's going to happen, all right? The Philistines will come down upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord, all right? If they come down on me before we make prayer to God, we're going to fail. So I need to do this thing. It says, I force myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering. He's almost saying, you left me no choice, or God's left me no choice but to step out on my own here. That's what he's saying here. All right, and then as we continue back down where we were, Samuel says in verse 13, thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God. All right? And it's interesting, I don't remember what chapter it is. I think it's in this book, though, where God literally says that he would rather obedience than sacrifice. Yeah, a couple chapters away yet, all right? But it comes around to that where God would rather have obedience, staying in his will, having faith that his plan is correct and that God's going to do what he promised, and staying in obedience rather than have to step out and make sacrifice or ask for. Sometimes I've always heard it said this way: it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission. All right. The reality is, in God's plan, it's the opposite. Am I right? It's better to stay in obedience than to ask for forgiveness afterwards, because then you're going to end up with consequences. Right? It doesn't. I'm very strong on my faith and my belief in what Scripture says, that if I'm saved, I'm not going to lose my salvation, and I'm confident in that. But I can still step out from God's will and God's plan for me, and I can still have earthly consequences. Am I right? Things will start falling apart for me. I'll fail and I'll fall on my face without God's help. All right? Doesn't mean that I lose my salvation. Doesn't mean I lose the Holy Spirit. But man, there can be a grieving there, and there can be a separation there, and just God watching me flounder and try to do things on my own. I can do that if I want to. All right? That's kind of what Saul is doing here. All right? And right away, it's interesting how right away the first consequences Samuel shares with him right away. All right? He's basically saying God could have used you and your family and your line to establish his kingdom forever upon the earth. All right? It says, at the end of verse 13, it says, for now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. He could have used him in a mighty way in Israel. But because of this one thing, right away, Samuel is sharing this consequence. It says, but now thy kingdom shall not continue. Saul's sons are not going to become king after him. That line is not going to continue. The Savior is not going to come through his line. All right? It's going to stop right there. That's probably one of the worst things that a king could hear, is that his kingdom is not going to continue with his family. All right? It says, now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart. Kind of interesting how we can kind of see a picture or a glimpse here of what God's plan is going to be not too far from here. because it literally, this is what David's known as being, is the man after God's own heart. All right, even through his mistakes and his failures in his life, he's still known as the man after God's own heart. But God is here prophesying, okay, it's not going to be you, but the kingdom is going to continue under this other gentleman. All right, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. All right, let's go on from there just a little bit here. And Samuel arose and gat him up from Gilgal unto Gibeah of Benjamin. And Saul numbered the people that were present with him, about 600 men. All right, how many men were with Saul before that? You remember? In the beginning of the chapter? Like 2,000 people, right? Now he's numbering them 600, all right, going up against all those Philistines. And following Jonathan his son and the people that were present with them abode in Gibeah of Benjamin, and the Philistines encamped in Michmash. And the spoilers came out of the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company turned unto the way that leadeth to Ophrah, unto the land of Shual. And another company turned the way to Beth-horon, and another company turned to the way of the border that looked to the valley of Zeboim, toward the wilderness. And now there was no smith found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make them swords or spears. Oh goodness, I don't want to get into politics here, but you can see kind of a picture between. Actually, I don't know how much you guys know about the Revolutionary War. And again, I don't want to get into politics too much, but what was one of the things that they started trying to take away from the colonists before the revolution started, or as it kind of started? All right, David, do you know or no?
Yeah, firearms.
Did they start taking away their ammunition or the firearms? All right, again, I'm not going to get political here, but you can see the picture here where the Philistines wisely made sure that the Israelites didn't have a way to make weapons. Right? They didn't have a way to make swords and spears and all that because they didn't have blacksmiths. It says, the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make them swords or spears. So that they would have the upper hand and they would have the tools necessary for battle, they made sure that the Hebrews did not have the tools necessary for battle. Does that make sense? As they're encamping around them and sending out these I don't know if we call them looters or what. But they're making sure that they didn't have the means, all right? This is what the Israelites started to do. And I had some pictures up that I was going to show you, but you guys probably know what these are better than I do. But all the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen every man his share and his culture and his axe and his mattock. You guys know what a culture is? Does everybody know?
It's a thing that goes besides the plow, keeps the mud from gathering up on them.
Yep. And it seemed like, and I might be speaking out of the side of my mouth because I'm not a farmer, but it seemed like in some of the diagrams I've seen of some of the old-fashioned plows, and it kind of helped set the depth maybe of how far the plow will go behind it. But it basically, if you take it apart, it probably looks similar to a big sword or something like that. And they started sharpening some of these tools is what it was. All right, there's another item here. His mattock. You guys know what a mattock is? Yeah, it's like a pick, kind of like a pick made for digging and stuff like that. All right, they started sharpening some of their farm tools is basically what it's doing. All right, so we have the Israelites way low in numbers, and their battle weapons of warfare are farm tools. All right, that's basically what we're looking at here. All right, it mentions an axe. We all know what an axe is. All right. In verse 21, yet they had a file for the mattocks and for the coulters and for the forks and for the axes to sharpen the goads. All right. And it came to pass in the day of battle that there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people that were with Saul and Jonathan. But with Saul and with Jonathan his son was there found. And the garrison of the Philistines went out to the passage of Michmash. And we're going to continue that story next week. But I think maybe the main thrust of this chapter is what we kind of discussed here, is Saul stepping out of God's will. All right? And maybe I give him a little bit more leeway than I ought to, but he he, in his defense, I mean, he looked around him and saw the battle getting ready to commence, and he didn't know what else to do, all right? And he lost faith, right? Yep. So what happens is when things start to go wrong, and something like this happens, we always have a choice. Am I right? And we really draw it down or simplify it. We always have two choices: which direction we're going to go. When the rubber hits the road and things start to fall apart, and we wonder what God's doing, and we don't know what to do, we always have two choices. All right? We have one choice of faith, and we have one choice of doubt. Right? You can boil it down to those two, I believe strongly. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but we're always faced with those two choices. All right? We have faith that God's going to do what he promised. We have faith that if we stay in God's plan and his will, that he's got it, right? Or we can, in doubt, start to do things on our own, right? And we've even seen it in previous chapters where Israel tried to go up against their enemy without God's help, tried to do it on their own way. Might have seemed wise in their own eyes, but they ended up in failure, all right? And here we have, because Saul decided that he was too scared to wait for God and his plan to come through. All right? We literally saw if he had waited just a couple more minutes, he could have done it God's way if he wanted to. Because right as he got done with the sacrifice, here comes Samuel. He could have waited. He could have waited on God. And usually when we make a mistake, we can look back and say, hey, I could have done this, and God would have had it. All right? But he could have waited. Instead, he chose to step out, and he said, well, man, I need to do this or else something's going to happen. And out of doubt for God's plan, he did his own thing, and we see consequences starting to come. All right, the first one was Samuel told him, okay, well, the kingdom's going to stop with you, and God's going to use a different family. Right away, he saw that. And then here we are with God's people, with just a couple hundred people and farm tools getting ready to go to battle. All right, and we're going to pick up the story in the next chapter, where we can see how it could have worked out differently. Am I right? And again, maybe I'm giving Saul too much here, but what he did makes sense in his mind. You know what I mean? And the Bible talks over and over people doing that which is right in their own eyes. All right, it's probably seemed right to them. Am I right? Sometimes when we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, what we do out of reaction feels like we're doing the right thing. All right. The reality is we need to go back to, well, what did God say? Right? What is God's plan? What does God want me to do? What is God's will here? Oftentimes we know, but we still don't know what to do. If that makes any sense. All right? We know what we're supposed to do, but we feel like we need to do something else. All right? And we've been, even in this ministry, we've been between a rock and a hard place before. And it seems like we see God working here, and we can stay on God's plan. When things come up and we're not sure what to do, we can stay in God's plan, or we can step out and try to figure things out on our own, and we can watch things fail. Am I right? Especially right now when we're seeing God work the victory, and we're starting to see, Satan's going to try to start doing battle, and you're going to see as God gets more and more victory, Satan's going to be lining up his armies against us, and there's going to be battles that we're going to have to fight. One of the interesting things about the book of Daniel near the end there, when one of the angels came to speak to Daniel, he kind of gave a little bit of a peek into what was going on spiritually. He literally said, I could have been here sooner if I wasn't held up by such and such. And he started naming some powers. All right, we started to see a little bit of a picture. Well, there really is a spiritual battle going on underneath the surface that we can't see with our eyes. And we have to know that when we start seeing the church growing, and we see more and more children come in the church, we start seeing the school grow the way it's grown. And we're starting to see God working in the lives of people in this area, in this neighborhood, in this town, in this city, and in this state. We're in a spiritually dark part of the country, and we're starting to see God do some things. Satan can't be happy. Am I right? There's got to be some battles coming, and coming quickly. All right? We're trying to get through this COVID thing. There's a battle there. All right? We don't know what's on the horizon, but we can be ready to know that something's going to happen, and we know that there's going to be battles and there's going to be trials, and we're going to have to figure it out. But the reality is, stay in God's plan, stay in His will, go back to His Word, seek direction from God, because when we start doing things on our own and trying to figure it out on our own, we're going to be failing. All right, I'm going to end there and let Pastor come on up, and I think that's kind of the focus of that chapter and this passage, where we can see, even out of good intentions, stepping out of God's will, consequences, and that we need to be ready to do battle when it comes.